All right, anyway, how many of you have ever heard of C.S. Lewis? All right, most everybody. How many of you have read anything of C.S. Lewis? How many of you understood any of it other than the Chronicles of Narnia? That's what I figured. Okay, cool. All right. C.S. Lewis, just to give you some of the rundown, then to get in his life. He's actually a fascinating character. And I think he's one of these guys in the Christian world that there's sort of this aura around him, almost like the myth of C.S. Lewis, because there's a lot to his life that is pretty deep and pretty intense, and I think can relate to pretty much every guy in this room. And it's mostly his life before he came to faith in Christ that I think is real relatable. Because we know a lot about him after he comes to Christ and he becomes this amazing author and defender of the Christian faith and, all this kind of stuff. And it's almost like unrelatable for many of us, teaches at Oxford and at Cambridge. But hopefully you'll get a sense that he's just a dude. He's a real guy and had some real life experiences that I think many of you are going to relate to. So starts out, he was born in 1898 in Belfast, Ireland. Contrary to what most people think, he was not English. He's Irish. But when he was 10 years old, he ended up being sent to boarding school in England and never really lived in Ireland again after that, although he always identified himself as being Irish, and that was just kind of his roots, his history. He had an older brother, a couple years older than him, named Warren. They were very close throughout their lives. When Lewis was 8 years old, his mother, who he was particularly close to, she died suddenly. 2 weeks after she died, his father sent him off to boarding school in England. Imagine what it's like, you're a child at this point. And your mother just died. Your older brother has been off at boarding school for 2 years already. So you've had this relationship with your mother where she's been kind of the caregiver, the person most engaged in your life. And for Lewis, this was a big deal because he was not a particularly outgoing athletic kid. He was very bookish even as a little kid. So he was kind of a homebody. They had a wonderful library at home. So he was always home around his mom. His mom dies. 2 weeks later, dad puts him on a boat and sends him to England. That's going to have an impact, okay? There's a lot of issues, and we're going to see as we go into Lewis's life how this affected him, down the road. The bookish nature of who he was obviously serves him well when he comes to Christ, and he starts writing all kinds of things and defending the faith and helping people come to know Christ in ways that were surprising and unique. But the fact that he was not this athletic kid, and he was actually kind of clumsy, because one of the weird things about Lewis, all right, I want you guys to do something for me. Okay, stick your thumb up, okay? Bend your thumb over. How many knuckles you got in your thumb? Now you guys are counting. I think I have 1, 2, 3. Lewis was short a knuckle in each thumb, which made him particularly clumsy. One of the great advancements in humankind is that we have opposable thumbs that we can grab things with. Imagine if your thumbs didn't work quite right. So he was clumsy, and he was kind of sort of self-conscious about this. So here he goes off to boarding school, early in the 1900s in England, where it is all about being the man and being tough on the football field, the soccer field and athletics and all that. And that's not him. So boarding school was miserable for him. You can imagine. He's the smart kid who's clumsy. He gets picked on, he gets ostracized, all that kind of stuff. His father sending him away, and then that experience in boarding school really put a wedge between him and his dad for the rest of his life. There are times when he early in his life before coming to Christ where he writes about his father, and it's not very nice kinds of things that he has to say. I think he's bitter. I think he's hurt. He probably doesn't even know why he feels this way. He just knows, this is the relationship with his dad. His dad was cold, distant, doing the best he could, being a typical dad in his country of the day. But it's a kid like Lewis, whose mom just died, didn't need a typical dad. He needed, something a little different. So the distance between the two of them, grows rapidly. And Lewis, for the next, probably 15 years or more, spends a lot of time hiding things from his father and just flat out lying to his dad about stuff. Lies to him about job prospects, lies to him about what's happening at school, lies to him about an interesting relationship that he has with a woman more than twice his age, which we'll get into. So there's this obvious distance between Lewis and his father. He gets ready to head off to Oxford. He's finished up with boarding school. He's going to go to Oxford. He's conditionally admitted. In the British system, the various universities have colleges, and you can get admitted to one of the colleges, but not yet to the university, which is what you want to get to. And Lewis was going to have to pass some pretty significant exams, especially in mathematics, to get into the university. And he was terrible at math. And so he's pretty worried about, am I going to get into the university, even though he got into one of the colleges? Well, all of that gets interrupted by World War I. Lewis ends up becoming an officer in the British Army and serves in the trenches in France. It's horrific, as you can imagine. It impacts him deeply. He is wounded when an artillery shell explodes near him, kills the guy next to him, wounds Lewis. He gets hospitalized, sent back to England. The war's over for him. He doesn't talk much at all about his experience in World War I. He makes this statement. He says, reality and I made a treaty. Basically what he did is he locked that away and said, I'm never going to deal with that. I'm not going to talk about that. That part of my life doesn't exist. Now, every once in a while, reality would push into the real world, and he had to wrestle with that. But for the most part, he tried to keep that hidden, in his life. He didn't want to deal with it. Much different from one of his best friends, J.R.R. Tolkien, who used his experience in the trenches in France to inform his writing of the Lord of the Rings novels. So they both approached it very differently. So Lewis, he gets back. He's going to start classes again at Oxford, and lo and behold, because he was an officer in the war, there's a rule that gets made that anyone who served as an officer in the war does not have to take the mathematics exams. So, all works out. One of the things that happened to him as he was preparing to head off to the front, as he was going through officer training, he had a roommate, a guy named Paddy Moore. And he and Paddy had made a pact with one another. And Paddy's sister, Maureen, overheard the pact. It's the only reason we know about it. And the pact was, if one of them dies, the other one will take care of the family. So if Lewis dies, then Paddy would take care of Lewis's father and his brother Warren. If Paddy died, Lewis would take care of Maureen, his sister, and his mom, Jane. Well, Paddy dies, and Lewis fulfills his commitment to Jane and Paddy. Jane is 45 years old. Lewis is 18 when they meet. The weird thing about their relationship is people have speculated ever since. Were they just close, or were they close? Because what ends up happening is that in some of Lewis's writings, there's some hints that while he's at Oxford, Jane comes and visits him in his dorm room. A little unusual for a 45-year-old woman to visit a 19, 20-year-old guy in his dorm room. They end up actually moving in. Maureen, Jane, his brother Warren, and Lewis buy a cottage outside of Oxford known as the Kilns. In England, you can't just have a house, you have to name it, okay? So everybody names their places. This was the Kilns. The arrangement was they all pooled their money together, but that Jane and Maureen would own it. C.S. and Warren would be able to live there for the rest of their days, and then when they died, Maureen and Jane would have complete and total ownership, occupancy of it all. So they ended up living together sort of as family from that point, in the early, mid-1920s until Jane died in, around, I think it was around 1950-ish. So long relationship here. And there are just some hints of a connection there. She actually destroyed all of her letters from C.S. Lewis, which was interesting in and of itself, because we have like stacks and stacks of his letters that he wrote to people that people saved. She didn't. So it's one of those things, we think of, hey, C.S. Lewis, this amazing Christian guy, loved Jesus. Yeah, but not always. There was a time in his life before he knew Christ, and he didn't come to know Christ until he was in his 30s, his early 30s. And, and there even he talks about some of his drunken escapades when he was in university. One in particular he writes about and he wrote about these during the time. It was one of the things that people did. You diaried a lot, wrote, what was going on. You wrote letters to people to tell them what was happening in your lives. He talks about one time waking up in his dorm room on the floor and not remembering how he got there. None of you have ever had that experience, but you get it. So he was a real guy with real issues. He had some father issues. He had some pain and trauma from being in the war. He had this relationship with this woman that nobody's quite sure what it was all about. And he was a guy. But he was also, one of the things he also hid from his father along the way was the fact that he was slowly but surely becoming an atheist. And this was a big deal, at the time. It wasn't a whole lot of atheists floating around. But Lewis, he really committed himself to the idea that there is no God at all. Because what he started to experience as a teenager, and I'm sure a lot of it had to do with the broken relationship with his dad and looking at the world around him, and the fact that he was such a voracious reader, he looked at what was going on in the world in terms of pain and suffering, and he couldn't reconcile that with the existence of a God. Anything that he understood about God, that just shouldn't have been. If there really was a God, this stuff shouldn't be happening in the world. But also, as he learned more and more about other religions, about other cultures, he said, these religions are all kind of dealing with the same stuff. And I've been told time and time again in my Christian upbringing that all of those other religions are myths. So what makes Christianity any different? Why isn't that just also a myth? Why isn't that just one more a wish fulfillment, that people need something? People who are weak have to have a crutch. They have to have something to rely on. And so he decided that that's what all religion was, including Christianity. But the other thing that was going on in Lewis's heart at this point, not so much his mind, somewhat his mind, but also his heart, is that he couldn't get away from the experiences he had that there was something more to life than just this materialistic world we live in. Even as a kid, he writes about trying to understand where joy came from, because he had these couple of experiences of things that were just delightful to him. And they were mystical experiences almost. He's like, where does that come from? What's that all about? And just this sense of there's something more to life in terms of purpose, a reason to being here. And he just looked at life and he kept having this sense of there's something else. So he graduates from Oxford, as this atheist. He gets a job at Oxford as a tutor and a lecturer. He begins to develop relationships with some of the other people who were there as part of the faculty and the staff. Particularly, Tolkien is one of those, and another very close friend, Hugo Dyson, and Charles Williams. They kind of become the core of a group called the Inklings that you may have heard about. The Inklings were a group of people who were writers, and they would get together on a regular basis, on a weekly basis, and they would share the latest things that they'd been writing. You would read it. You wouldn't just hand out, copies of it. You would have what you wrote, that you wanted to get feedback on, and they would critique one another and encourage one another, and you have arguments and debates about these things. And they did it most often at a pub in Oxford called the Eagle and Child. It's a great place to go and sit and have a beer, by the way, unless you're Baptist. Well, you can do that if there's no other Baptists around, so it's okay. All right. So they would spend every week there, just having these conversations. It was part of those conversations that Lewis continually encouraged Tolkien to write Lord of the Rings. Because Tolkien was very uncertain about it. He was very insecure about it. And people talk about Lewis actually being the midwife who helped give birth to one of the greatest pieces of literature of the 20th century, because he just encouraged the guy. And that seemed to be part of his character, that he cared for people, he encouraged people. And when you read some of his letters, like he wrote to people all around the world. Anybody who wrote to him, they got a handwritten letter back. And he deeply engaged in their experiences in their life and encouraged them. And he was that kind of guy, once he came to faith in Christ. So, what ends up happening is that as they're building these relationships and getting to know one another, Lewis is struck by a couple of thoughts, particularly as it relates to Tolkien. You remember Lewis he was born in Ireland, in Northern Ireland, in Belfast. It was in the time when there was a great uprising in Ireland, the Easter uprising that brought independence eventually to part of Ireland. The whole Catholic Protestant thing was a big deal. And Lewis said, Tolkien eliminated two prejudices in my life. He said, I grew up knowing that you should never trust a Roman Catholic. And here's Tolkien, a Catholic. He said, I also knew that you should never trust someone who is a philologist. Technical term for somebody dealing with languages, and that's what Tolkien was as well. So he said, the two groups of people that I despise most, one of my best friends. And that starts to work on him and change him. So one day, as it happens, Tolkien and Lewis and Dyson are having long conversation late into the night. They take a walk through Oxford, a pathway called Addison's Walk. And the famous story is, as they're walking along and they're talking about faith, Lewis has moved from being an atheist to believing there's a God, but he hasn't embraced Christianity yet. And as they're talking, Tolkien says to him, he says, I don't understand. You are so committed to myth. And by what they mean by myth is by stories that speak truth. Not like made up stuff that's fake, but for them it's a technical term of something that speaks to overarching truth. He says, and you keep rejecting Christianity. He said, but Tolkien said, it is the true myth. And you might think, well, how can it be a true myth? Again, understand their terminology. They're talking about something that explains reality. And what Tolkien was saying to Lewis is, Christianity is the only thing that explains the world. It's the only thing that explains life. It's the only thing that explains this stuff that has been gnawing at you of where does joy come from? Why is there pain and suffering in life? All these things that you wrestle with, Christianity has the explanations for that. And as Lewis tells the story, it was at that moment on that walk, and there's a plaque there now where it happened, that Lewis came to embrace and believe in Christ. Shows you the impact of close friends being engaged with you for years, because it was several years of the relationship and this engagement before Lewis comes around and gives his life to Jesus. We think it's just so simple, like, hey, a preacher stands up, gives a message and says, hey, anybody wants to receive Jesus, come on down front. We think like that's the whole story. No, that's like almost none of the story whatsoever. Certainly that's the case with Lewis. His friends hung in there with him and cared about him. So he comes to faith in Christ. He starts writing, things that really embrace Christian theology and applying it to life. He writes, one of the first things he writes is the problem of pain, and dealing with why is there suffering, in the world. He begins to explore why there's morality at all, and what the purpose and meaning is that we have in life. He becomes probably the most desired lecturer at Oxford. The way the system there works, it's not so much that you sign up for classes and that's where you're going and you're hearing, that professor teach for a whole semester. There's a whole lot of lectures that professors offer that just say, hey, on such and such a day, I'm going to be speaking on this topic, and people just come to hear them. And Lewis's lectures were always packed, and people just wanted to hear what he had to say. World War II comes along, and he ends up being part of the BBC, the British Broadcasting Corporation, doing regular weekly broadcasts for the British people in the midst of the Blitz and all of that, dealing with Christian issues. and dealing with the issues of the war and the world and your purpose and suffering and meaning and all this kind of stuff. And he becomes this incredible celebrity across England because people were tuning in to listen to Lewis to find comfort, to find purpose in the midst of all this, to find, some sense of hope in the midst of this war that was just horrendous. And so he becomes incredibly popular, and he keeps writing books all along the way. During the war, living at the kilns in Oxford, they end up having children sent to their home from London during the Blitz to live out of the way of the bombs dropping. That becomes the impetus for the beginning of the Chronicles of Narnia, of some kids who are fleeing the Blitz and living in this home, this strange home with this professor guy. So it's a little bit sort of autobiographical. So Lewis continues on. He's writing. He's becoming famous in so many ways. He is still a bachelor at this point. Jane dies. Maureen still lives there. His brother Warren still lives there. Warren had been in the Army. He was a retired Army officer. Also struggled, though, with alcoholism. So C.S. Lewis is caring for him as well. He ends up, through correspondence, meeting an American woman named Joy Davidman. And something clicks. Lewis falls in love. Joy is his intellectual equal. They love having conversations about deep things in life, and he becomes this changed man. She has 2 little boys. They end up getting married in 1956. It was a civil ceremony because she's divorced, and the Church of England at the time isn't going to allow that to happen, but they get married. Tragically, 4 years later in 1960, she dies from cancer. Lewis writes his book, A Grief Observed. It's about the experience of going through the pain and the loss. He wrote it under a pseudonym. And it gets published, and it becomes this incredibly popular book throughout England, to the point where friends of his are coming with this book and saying, "Hey, you should read this. I think this will help you." They had no idea that he's the guy who wrote it. It wasn't until after he dies that it gets published under his own name at that point. Lewis ends up dying from kidney failure. He dies in the kilns, which incidentally, if you ever go to Oxford, you can actually visit the kilns. I've had a chance to do that, and it's kind of just cool to be in a place where, this guy lived and studied and wrote. But he dies in the kilns on November 22nd, 1963. Who just said it? The day that John F. Kennedy dies. Lewis died about 55 minutes before Kennedy was shot. Lewis is this guy, he is famous throughout England. His death gets overshadowed, as you can imagine. There's another guy who dies that same day, Aldous Huxley, who wrote A Brave New World. There's an amazing book you ought to get a hold of by a Catholic philosopher named Peter Kreeft. And what Kreeft does, he writes a book, it's a long title, Between Heaven and Hell, A Dialogue Somewhere Beyond Death, with John F. Kennedy, C.S. Lewis, and Aldous Huxley. And basically what he does is he imagines the 3 of them having died within close proximity of one another, ending up in the waiting room to eternity and having a conversation about reality and life and God and all that. So if you want to read something interesting, and it's a conversation. It's them just talking back and forth. But so that wasn't Lewis, that was Peter Kreeft, but Lewis is in the book. So Lewis is most famous as being an apologist, a defender of the Christian faith. A guy who helps people grow deeper in the relationship with Christ, to get to know him, to grow in that. 2 key things of his apologetic method, if you will. One is he keeps zeroing in on the universal existence of morality. If there's not a God, why do we even think that there's a right and a wrong? The idea being, if we think there's a moral code that exists, there must be someone who wrote the code. There must be someone behind it. So he really approaches things from that level. But probably his most famous thing is what is called his trilemma. He said, look, when it comes to Jesus, because it really is all about Jesus when you get down to it, he said, when it comes to Jesus, you've got three options. Because Jesus claimed to be God in the flesh. There's just no doubt about that. He made that claim. So you got three options. Either he was lying because he knew he wasn't God in the flesh. He's just lying about it. Or he was a lunatic because he didn't know that he was not God in the flesh, but he thought he was. Or he's the Lord because he claimed to be God in the flesh and he really was. You know, he kind of breaks it down that simple. Focus on Jesus. What do you think about Jesus? You think, oh, he was just some good teacher? Sorry, it doesn't work. A good teacher in their right mind doesn't claim to be God. He's either lying to you or he's nuts. You know, was he a prophet? Well, same thing. You know, take whatever you want. Anything other than Lord doesn't work for us. So he zeroes in on Jesus. The list of books and things that he's written is massive. Some of them are really tough to get through because he's writing very much as a guy in England in the 1930s or 40s or 50s. And so there's lots of references that are cultural at the time that, you know, you got to work through to figure out. But a lot of the stuff, if you really sit with it and wrestle with it, becomes incredibly powerful and deep. As I said, he's written a massive number of things, which is why the quotable Lewis is this thick. This isn't everything he wrote. This is just the cool stuff that he said that people thought this is great quotes. That tells you something. So let me work through them all. Let me give you a couple of them that I think are just powerful. This first one, Lewis, it's pretty much agreed that Lewis made this statement in thinking about how he treated his own father. Okay. To be a Christian means to forgive the inexcusable because God has forgiven the inexcusable in you. And he's dealing with both forgiving the inexcusable that his father did, but also the inexcusable way that he treated his own father. So powerful stuff. If we find ourselves with a desire that nothing in this world can satisfy, the most probable explanation is we were made for another world. That's that yearning thing he had as a kid, that there's something else. He's saying if you have that yearning that there's something else, maybe it's because there is something else that you were made for. I love this one. I didn't go into religion to make me happy. I always knew that a bottle of port could do that. If you want a religion to make you feel comfortable, I certainly do not recommend Christianity. It would seem, this is from Weight of Glory, it would seem that our Lord finds our desires not too strong, but too weak. We are half-hearted creatures, fooling about with drink and sex and ambition when infinite joy is offered us. Like an ignorant child who wants to go on making mud pies in a slum because he cannot imagine what is meant by the offer of a holiday at the sea. We are too easily pleased. If you look for truth, you may find comfort in the end. If you look for comfort, you will get neither comfort or truth, only soft soap and wishful thinking to begin, and in the end, despair. True humility is not thinking less of yourself, it's thinking of yourself less. To have faith means, of course, trying to do all that he says, meaning Christ. There would be no sense in saying that you trusted a person if you would not take his advice. Thus, if you have really handed yourself over to Christ, it must follow that you are trying to obey him, but trying in a new way, a less worried way. Not doing these things in order to be saved, but because he has begun to save you already. Not hoping to get into heaven as a reward for your actions, but inevitably wanting to act in a certain way because a first faint gleam of heaven is already inside you. That's the gospel right there. Remember, he is an artist and you are only a picture. You can't see it. So quietly submit to be painted. Keep fulfilling all the obvious duties of your station. You really know quite well enough what they are. asking forgiveness of each failure and then leaving it alone. You are in the right way. Walk. Don't keep looking at it. Relying on God has to begin all over again every day, as if nothing had been done. I think that if God forgives us, we must forgive ourselves. This is powerful. Otherwise, it is almost like setting up ourselves as a higher tribunal than Him. People say, oh, I just can't forgive myself. Well, are you greater than God? God can forgive you. Yeah. I remember Christian teachers telling me long ago that I must hate a bad man's actions, but not hate the bad man. Or as they would say, hate the sin, but not the sinner. I used to think, what a silly straw-splitting distinction. How could you hate what a man did and not hate the man? But years later, it occurred to me that there was one man to whom I had been doing this all my life, namely myself. However much I might dislike my own cowardice or conceit or greed, I went on loving myself. There had never been the slightest difficulty about it. In fact, the very reason why I hated the things was that I loved the man. Just because I loved myself. I was sorry to find that I was the sort of man who did those things. This is deep. Die before you die. There's no chance after. My argument against God was that the universe seems so cruel and unjust, but how had I got the idea of just and unjust? A man does not call a line crooked unless he has some idea of a straight line. What was I comparing this universe with when I called it unjust? Christianity, if false, is of no importance, and if true, of infinite importance. The only thing it cannot be is moderately important. And then finally, God allows us to experience the low points in life in order to teach us the lessons that we would learn no other way. You can leave now.